Good morning. My name is David Lee, and I'm the Director of Education for the Dallas Historical Society. Founded in 1922, we collect, preserve, and exhibit the heritage of Dallas and Texas to educate and inspire present and future generations. For more information about the Dallas Historical Society and upcoming programs, please visit www.dallashistory.org. Welcome to the 2024 Reed and Stanley Graff Texas History Symposium. Our first speaker this morning is Kolby Lanham. He is the senior researcher and historian at the Alamo. He's originally from Muleshoe, Texas, and has deep ties to the Lone Star State. His ancestors fought in the Texas Revolution at the Battle of San Jacinto. Kolby came to San Antonio in 2012 after serving in the United States Air Force. Kolby's been with the Alamo team for over a decade and was promoted to senior researcher and historian in 2020. In this role, Kolby helped share and shape the Alamo story with visitors from around the globe. Kolby holds a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and a Master of Arts in History from the University of Texas at San Antonio. As a reminder, if you are an educator, please sign in so that you can receive continuing professional education credits. But please join me this morning in offering a warm welcome to Kolby to the Hall of State.
How are you doing this morning? Thank you so much for having us. We're very excited to be here today. It's my first time being in this building, and it's stunning. Caught completely off guard about how beautiful this place is. So yeah, we're very honored to be here. Today I'm going to speak about the weapons of the Texas Revolution, but primarily focusing on the artillery and the cannons that were used during that revolution. The title of the presentation, Revolutions and the Weapons That Won Them, was my thesis topic title. And what we'll do is we'll go through and we'll talk about how the artillery has been used, how it got to Texas. Who's all been to the Alamo? I hope a lot of hands go up. All right. Oh, Max. So the cannons that are at the Alamo now, we have 12 of the original 23 cannons that were at the Battle of the Alamo. We're very privileged to have found those because, as you'll see through the presentation, most of them have been scattered to the wind, and we're able to track them down through our research and gracious donations from Texans like y'all. And so we'll go through all of that. At the end, we'll have a Q&A. Don't be shy. Working at the Alamo, we get about 2 million people a year who visit our site, and I've heard every question from where's the big bell with a crack in it to where did Thomas Jefferson die? So we get everything. So if y'all have questions, feel free to ask them. It's what we're here for. All right, so whenever people come to the Alamo, they look at the artillery. One of the first things they say, well, these cannons are here. These must be Texas cannons. They were probably made right down the road in Austin or somewhere like that. And the truth of the matter is that the artillery of that age, it traveled throughout the globe. And the majority of the cannons, we found out through research during COVID when the Alamo shut down. We were working on replicating some of the cannons. And I was doing research late into the night looking at the famous 18-pounder, which is going to be a topic of this conversation. And for about 40 years, all the research said it was an English gun, made in England and then brought into the New World and then used in the Revolution. That cannon's probably the most famous cannon associated with the Texas Revolution. And as we started looking, we're going to replicate this. I have to get the measurements correct. And as I'm digging, I find out that not only is it not English, it was not an 18-pounder when it started its life. It was a 12-pounder, and it was made in Sweden. Not a country you would associate with the Battle of the Alamo or Texas. They're known for IKEA and meatballs, but we're changing that with our research, which is a great thing. Sweden actually is known for its iron ore. It's one of the richest countries in the world in the quality of iron that they have. And when they discovered that ore in the 1500s and 1600s, they had the iron, they just had to extract it from the ground. They bring in the Dutch, and the Dutch were masters of that. And they pull the iron from the earth in mines like this here. Deep mines, they bring the iron out, and they start making these cannons. The iron in that period was extremely expensive. A cannon, let's say a 6-pound gun, that's probably about 4 to 5 feet long, weighing about 800 pounds, would cost as much as a new house today. That's how expensive that iron is. And so the artillery is a key to battle, and getting your hands on that is extremely important, as we know through the Texas Revolution and how it's used at the Battle of the Alamo. we go here. Once the iron's extracted, it's sent to a foundry. This is an actual engraving that I own. It's from around 1820, and it's showing a foundry that we believe many of the Alamo cannons were actually made at. And it's in Finspång, Sweden. And for that reason, most of the artillery is called a Finspång gun or a Finbanger. So really interesting. But what you're seeing here is the iron being brought in. It's being melted down. And then they're going to cast and make guns like these in the background. And they're going to ship them all over the globe. Sweden, at the time, was not known for making cannons. It was England who made most of the world's artillery, and then Spain and France after that. And what happens is that England starts making these guns, and they're very good at it, and they sell them to anyone and everyone who wants them. And then England makes some enemies of those same people, and next thing you know, on the high seas and throughout battlefields in Europe, they're fighting their own artillery. So the English government says, no more. We're not shipping our guns outside of this nation anymore. And so Sweden says, oh, we can do that. We got the iron. So they start making these guns. And that's part of the reason for so many years they thought this famous 18-pound cannon that was used at the Battle of the Alamo was English. Because the Swedish kind of looked at that and said, yeah, we'll just copy what they did. And that's where you end up with these cannons. So they're melting down the iron, and they're making the guns. What's the next spot? Well, once it's cast, you have to bore it out. You would choose the size of the projectile, whether it be a 6-pound ball, an 18-pound ball, and you would use a series of stepped drill bits, and you would spin the entire cannon on this lathe. And it's a long process. This one happens to be bronze, but they did make them out of iron, of course. And then once it was bored to the appropriate size, you would make cannonballs, and you'd send it on its way. There's another way you could do it instead of a laid down lathe, like they have here, using the gravity of the gun, spinning on a drill bit, and they'd have a donkey going around in circles, and it would hollow out that gun tube. And then the cannons will be shipped throughout the globe. They're used, as I said, on the high seas by Sweden. Sweden did not discriminate. They sold them to everybody. And they went all over the globe. And they're not just being used by the militaries of Europe, they're being used by private citizens. If you had a ship and you wanted to move throughout the Mediterranean or maybe the English Channel with your goods, the more cannons you had on your ship, the less duty and tax you paid at port. Those became known as insurance guns. So that's your insurance to support the cargo. Well, the guys on those ships, they weren't really well trained, and so anytime they saw a ship they didn't know, they just shot at it. And when you shoot a cannon, the ball doesn't come out straight. It actually comes out like a tadpole swimming in the water, and it takes off small bits of the cannon on the interior of the gun. And thus, you increase what's called windage, the amount of deviation off the target when you fire the ball. And so as they became less and less accurate, the man who runs the ship says, you know what, next port, take all the guns out and we'll get fresh ones. That's where Texas got its guns. We got the hand-me-downs from different merchants, mostly in New Orleans and the East Coast of the United States. Those cannons are put on Texas ships and brought into Texas and used to great effect during the Revolution. See them, this is not the Alamo, but this is Napoleonic, the Napoleonic era, and this is very indicative of the warfare you would have saw at the Battle of the Alamo. So when we're talking about the cannons, it's important to talk about logistics because the cannons themselves, they don't just appear out of the ether. They have to be moved around, and it takes a lot of manpower to do that. If you were to try to move a cannon, let's say the famous 18-pounder, you would need about 14 men to move that. 7 men equal 1 horse. So 7 men could do the work of 1 horse, and then you pull that cannon, you're gonna need a team of about 9 horses in total to haul all of the supplies needed to fire and maintain that gun. There are thousands of things that need to be brought with it, from traveling forges, picks, pig iron, extra cannonballs, and it all starts to add up. If you were to look at a large battle like Waterloo, for instance, there were over 500 artillery pieces there. That meant there were close to 2,000 horses on that battlefield dedicated just for the movement of the supplies, accoutrement, and the guns themselves at the battle, just on one side, the English side. So it kind of puts things in perspective. The cannon carriages themselves were actually more difficult to make than the actual cannon tube, You needed to have skilled carpenters, and Texas did not have that. Even when the Spanish were in charge of the Alamo and using it as a fort, they were putting out advertisements for American carpenters to come down to this cool new place called Tejas and work as a carpenter. And some men didn't answer the call, but the carriages would really go through the extreme climate of Texas, and on average, they last about 2 to 7 years max. To test the guns, the actual gun tube, they would usually fill it with double the amount of gunpowder it needed. So if you have an 18-pounder, the max charge for an 18-pounder is 9 pounds of gunpowder. They would put close to 16 to 18 pounds in there and fire it off. And if the gun didn't explode, it got its proof marks and got sent off. The carriages that carried the actual gun tube, they would be tested as well. And one of my sources I found in my research said they took 14 cannon carriages and dropped them from a height of 6 feet to see if they could survive that fall. And 9 of the 14 broke in half. So they go through a lot of trial and error to try and get the artillery where you could move it throughout the battlefield. And there's a lot of logistical things that go along with it. I mentioned that there's a lot of tools and things you need to carry around with the guns. The 18-pounder, for instance, with all of its supplies, which is 100 cannonballs, which weighed 1,800 pounds, and 500 pounds of gunpowder that needed to go with it, weighed about 19,000 pounds. And so all this starts to add up, especially when you think about the Mexican army and their movements north from Mexico and the trials and tribulations they had to go through to get here. Of course, this is the Alamo. For those of you who have never seen this map, it's a great map showing San Antonio, what was then called Bihar, and the Alamo itself right across the San Antonio River. The Alamo had more cannons inside of its walls than any other fort west of the Mississippi. They had 23 functioning cannons, and they had a couple that were unmounted. They ranged from a cannon that fires about the size of a golf ball, all the way up to the 18-pounder, which fired a shot 6.5 inches across. Huge cannonballs. Think about a bowling ball. I mentioned the carriages and horses and how heavy they could be and the issues with moving them throughout the battlefield. When Santa Anna is marching his army north, they encounter many streams and they have to make makeshift bridges. You could not send 2 cannons across on one bridge. The bridge would collapse. The average weight of a soldier, let's take a cavalry officer or maybe a dragoon, he's going to weigh about, at that period, about on average 198 pounds with his gear, plus his horse of about 1,000 pounds. And in total, they would come out around 2,000 pounds of gear and weight. That's one horse. And so the movements of an army matter, especially whenever the Mexican army is moving north, trying to get to San Antonio, encountering a lot of logistical issues. Let's see here. So obviously the Mexican army is a proper army. They are not volunteers like what you'd see at the Battle of the Alamo. And as I mentioned, the logistics it just weighs heavy on the soldiers themselves. The armies of the time, they did wear Napoleonic style uniforms like this, and they marched in large columns like this. When they came to a bridge, for instance, they could only walk about 2 men abreast. So if you have a 3,000-man army, it could take you 2 days to cross a river crossing. It could really hamper the movements of your force. These are just images of the period showing what a camp might look like in that period. And of course, the nightmares. You can see a guy fell off the bridge, no one's helping him, which you can see. The Mexican army, when they said they were marching northward, they had their animals were overloaded with gear. And after their defeat at San Jacinto, they're retreating with all of this gear and artillery, and they're exhausted. They're throwing stuff aside, they're taking off their uniforms, and they get stuck in what's now referred to as a sea of mud. And one soldier says he witnessed a large pack animal, a mule, overladen with gear that slipped and fell into a mud hole, and his feet went straight up and he disappeared. And so you can imagine the chaos, and it's literally the march of these men becomes what I refer to as a manufacture of misery. But what about battle? Well, that 18-pound ball I mentioned earlier that's fired with 9 pounds of black powder, That would move the same speed as a 9mm handgun round. So if you're talking about 1,800 feet in 1 second, very, very quick. Excuse me. I think it's around 9,000 feet a second, excuse me. And so that projectile is moving very quickly. They didn't just fire a solid shot, they fired exploding rounds called howitzer rounds that would fragment like a grenade. They also fired what's called grape shot, which is small balls loaded into the gun and fired off like a gigantic shotgun. And you can see some of that being put to use here. This is obviously the famous Battle of the Alamo. This is one of the best paintings I know of, done by Gary Zaboli, showing the mass of men on the north wall when it was breached. Now, the Mexican Army will gain control of these cannons on the outer walls, and they will turn them on the Texian forces and use it against them. Of course, after the battle is over with, the Texians are killed, and what happens to the cannon? Well, they're mostly rounded up and put back on their platforms. They're removed, they're repaired, and they're being used by the Mexican Army. You can see this is another one by Gary Zaboli. This is the fight for the famous 18-pounder. For those of you who are curious, I won't go into extreme detail, but what happens when a man is hit by a cannonball? There's a lot that goes on. Getting hit by an 18-pounder, there's not really much of anything left. But they're also shooting the grape shot, which I mentioned, and they're also using musket balls. So there's a lot of projectiles flying through the air, and there were doctors after several conflicts who would write out what they saw, and very gruesome. But one of the ones that stuck out to me the most was a man who was hit. He wakes up in a field hospital, and the doctor said, "You're going to recover, and you're okay. We found your money, here it is." And he said, "I was wearing pants with no pockets. I didn't have any money." And it was the man in front of him. That change became projectiles and embedded inside of his body. So when you think about the combat, it's not a quick and easy thing for a lot of these men. They went through a lot at the Battle of the Alamo, and some pretty gruesome stuff. Well, you fast forward, May of 1836, the Mexican Army gets word that Santana has been defeated at the Battle of San Jacinto, and they're told to retreat. And the young captain who's in charge of the Alamo, the Mexican Army captain, he's given specific instructions: take all the Alamo artillery off of its carriages, take them outside of the fort, and throw them in the San Antonio River. That's an order he's supposed to follow, but Santana's not really there, right? So he can do whatever he thinks is necessary, and you already know how hard it is to move these cannons, right? So what does he do? He says, "No, we're not going to do that. We're going to actually take them, and we're going to roll them into the defensive ditches at the bottom of the ramps, and we'll just cover them with some dirt, and no one will know." And so he writes back to Santana. He says, "Yep, we threw them in the river." And Santana's like, good job, right? So that's the story, and they stick to it, and the Mexican Army leaves Texas. Well, guess what happens? The area around the Alamo starts to grow. The city of San Antonio grows. And those cannons are actually going to be found by a man named Samuel Maverick. Here's the Alamo for reference, Alamo Plaza and the Alamo here. And this is Samuel Maverick's house. One day, his wife, Mary Maverick, says, "I want a new picket fence." And Sam says, "Okay, let's get out there." And he starts digging with a couple men, and he strikes iron. And they start uncovering it, and they find about 15 cannons in his front yard. The ones that were supposed to be thrown in the river by the Mexican Army ended up being buried in his front yard. So Sam does the smart thing. He sees some of these are brass or bronze, and he knows he can make money off of that. So Sam sends one off and ends up in a bank vault in Philadelphia to pay off a debt. His church needs a new bell, so he uses one of the cannons, a large 6-pound, what we call a 6-pounder. It weighs about 1,000 pounds. He gives it to his church, and they send it up to Neely, New York, and they melt it down and make it into a bell. And that's actually still in the bell tower of St. Mark's Episcopal, about 3 blocks from the Alamo. We believe that's actually the famous come and take it cannon that was used at the Battle of Gonzales, because it matches the same weight of that gun. And so Sam kind of just sends the guns out wherever he likes, and then he takes the iron ones and he reburies them. Well, then the Civil War comes around. And the city of San Antonio is on the list to be attacked by the Union Army. So what happens? Well, the Confederates go to Sam and say, hey, we heard you have some cannons in your yard. Let's dig them up because we may need them to defend the city. And they dig them up, and the guy's like, oh, those are in bad shape. So they're not going to use them. But there was a conversation about actually melting some of them down and making new cannons. For reference, the cannons that we have today that were in Sam Maverick's yard, a lot of those were actually cast in the year around 1670. And so the idea of using those again in 1863 is pretty wild. Now, Sam Maverick gives a couple of more cannons away. One woman who actually lives in a little house nearby, it'd be about right here. She's gardening one morning and finds 3 small swivel cannons that fired about a ball about the size of a golf ball. And she gives one to her family and then keeps one for herself. And her family is having a great old time on the 4th of July. And a couple of the cowboys decide to load it up with some gunpowder and shoot it off, and the cannon explodes. There's another one that went to a nearby park, and it also was the victim of a celebration for New Year's, and it exploded. And so time goes on, and some of those cannons that are still buried in the yard are found again. When Sam Maverick's house is demolished and they build a hotel there, and they put Fisher's Drug Store on the bottom, and as they're digging through the floor, they find more of the Alamo cannons. I'm proud to say that every cannon inside this image is now in our collection. So we've saved these. But what happened to the famous 18-pounder? Well, some soldiers are in Alamo Plaza, and they're walking through, and they find something sticking out of the dirt, and they uncover it, and it turns out to be the famous 18-pounder. How do we know that? Well, again, COVID. I'm at home, and I'm trying to replicate this gun, and we actually sent this image off, and they were able to use a program called SketchUp on a computer to measure the muzzle of that gun, and that let us know that that fired an 18-pound projectile, and that's what we're looking at. So once we determined that, they said, okay, Kolby, see if you can find any more pictures of that gun and the history of it. Well, we knew it got moved to right after the soldiers find it, the muzzle is blocked with a cannonball in mud. And the locals say, well, you know what's inside there? That's all of the Alamo defenders' gold and pocket watches and their money. And so those soldiers, they take an acid-stained rope or soaked rope, and they saw on that gun for 2 days. And they hit it with hammers, and they snapped the muzzle off. And guess what was inside? Nothing. And so now they have this big, gigantic cannon that's broken off on the end. The city says, you got to move that. And they're like, no, it's not ours. And so it just sits there. And so the city finally takes and moves it to a nearby park. And they put it up on a plinth. You can see it now has a broken muzzle. And it just sits in the park. Well, around 1917, it disappears from photographs. So we had a problem. We had to make a cannon out of something we don't even know where it is, and we don't have measurements. So what we ended up doing is we found a third image. A woman in town donated copies to us, and this is her ancestor, and she gave us his name, and I went and looked through the archives, and I found his World War I draft card, which gave me his height. And then we went out to that local park, and we found the stone plinth that the cannon once sat on. There was about that much showing in one of the planter's boxes, and we dug with trowels and got measurements from that. And with the measurements of the plinth it sat on and his height, we were able to determine how long the cannon was. We sent those off and had a styrofoam cannon made, and it turned out really well. And then we sent that to a foundry in Ohio, and they cast this. And so that's currently what the Alamo is, one of the many projects the Alamo is working on, is replicating the Alamo artillery, putting it back on the battlefield to give people an idea of what the Alamo once had. Those artillery pieces are now in the plaza if you haven't been. This one is the famous 18-pounder. It's up on a platform at the same height it would have been at the Battle of the Alamo. So for the first time since the battle, and that wall was torn down, visitors can go and stand by that cannon, a exact replica, and also stand at the same height as the Alamo defenders. We have replicated about 11 artillery pieces and scattered them throughout the plaza. And if you've been to the Alamo or you take friends and family, you know that when you show up, and you say, here it is, and we're very proud of it, Texans are. But most of the time, what I hear walking through the plaza is that it? Or that's very small. And so what we're doing with this project is putting them back on the battlefield to give people an idea and an understanding of where they're standing and how large the battlefield once was.